good evening everyone. Boa tarde a todos. Gostaria de agradecer a vossa presença, aos que estão presencialmente e aos que estão online. Hoje cabe a mim fazer a apresentação do Seminário de Economia Política. O nosso convidado é o Jewellord Nem Singh. Ele é atualmente professor assistente at the Institute of Political Science na Leiden University, mas irá se mudar brevemente para o International Institute of Social Studies, de DINÂMIA, que é parte da Universidade de Rotterdam. Ganhou recentemente um projeto do European Research Council, da categoria de Starting Grant, intitulado Green Industrial Policy in the Age of Rare Metals. Liderou ainda projetos científicos financiados pelo programa de Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Research Fellowship e pela Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Em termos de publicações, foi coeditor de 3 livros distintos, o último dos quais intitulado Developmental States Beyond East Asia, pela Routledge. Jewellord Nem Singh é ainda editor de special issues diversos e tem autoria de diversos artigos em revistas de topo nível internacional, tal como a New Political Economy, Third World Quarterly ou Annual Review of Environmental and Resources. Por fim, Jewellord Nem Singh obteve o seu doutoramento no Departamento de Política da Universidade de Sheffield, onde fomos colegas e partilhámos um pequeno gabinete durante a fase final dos nossos projetos de doutoramento. Gostaria de, por fim, salientar que os ciclos de conversas sobre economia política decorrem entre novembro e julho de 2020, organizados pela Associação Portuguesa de Economia Política, pelo Doutoramento Interdisciplinar em Economia Política e pelo Departamento de Economia Política do ISCTE e UEL. Gostaria então de passar a palavra ao nosso convidado e agradecer imenso por ter aceito o nosso convite para estar aqui presente. Passo-lhe a palavra. Não.
Yes. Let's see. Can they see it? Does it work? Do I just? Or I have to share the screen? Just share the screen. Yes.
Full screen.
Okay. Should have.
No.
So thank you, João, for the invitation. It's a great privilege to be here. I'm presenting one of the new projects I've been working on in the past 6-7 months during the COVID time. And it's really an extension of the project that we did back in 2018 on industrial policy. It all started as a Twitter debate. This project started in Twitter when people started talking about, what do we mean by industrial policy? What do we know about industrial policy? Is the Chinese model of state capitalism, is that industrial policy, or is the Brazilian model the model for industrial policy? So the project came together with this idea of looking into the political and institutional factors that might explain why some countries pursue industrial policy and why some countries are successful and others have failed. So the project is essentially about how we think about industrial policy, how we think about the political and institutional conditions that lead to the construction of industrial strategy and the extent to which this leads to structural transformation of the economy. Okay. So I really start with any discussion on industrial policy. I always start with what we know, which is, the story of industrialization is the story of European industrialization. So we start with the significance of the move from agriculture to manufacturing and industry. And hence, this is actually a very iconic photo of that kind of structural transformation. So I think what I want to do today is to just set out some of the key debates in the literature within political economy. So this is actually more political economy of development, but I actually think there's a debate even within the European context that we talked about, industrial policy. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the substantive part of the presentation. So I'll simply start with the context and the main questions that how we set out the project. and then how we try to reframe the debate. What are the questions that we need to think about when we talk about industrial policy in the 21st century? And then I'll present to you one of the frameworks that we've been developing in the project. To a large degree, this framework is the same framework I'll be using in the ERC starting grant that I have, but I applied to a specific case study. And then I'll draw out some of the important lessons that we can think and learn from Brazil and India. So I'll discuss in a little bit, the papers in the special issue, but these are the two main countries I think that are quite interesting. And then I'll end the discussion by talking about the main challenges for studying industrial policy. All right, so let me start with a very important question. Why should we spend our time studying state-led development? Why should we invest understanding state capitalism in the 21st century? And I think if The Economist, one of the most liberal newspapers, a magazine you can find in the Western world, has actually put together special issues, special editions on the rise of state capitalism, I think we should pay attention. And of course, they come from a particular point of view of why we need to study state capitalism. They see this more as a threat to the Western liberal order. But from an intellectual perspective, I think state-led development is something that is embedded in a historical process. It's sort of in an ebbing and flowing. And so the idea, the argument of neoliberal economists, the argument back in the 90s and early 2000s that neoliberalism ended the developmental state seemed a little bit of a premature statement to me. And in fact, I think one of the most interesting arguments that you will start observing in the literature is that the historical moment in which neoliberalism became dominant in countries that have implemented industrial policy and state-led development, neoliberalism seems to be a blip in their historical continuum, in the historical moment. And so what we actually find are more dynamic continuities and changes in the model of state capitalism. So if we think of countries like Turkey, Brazil, even India that has extensively liberalized their economy, a lot of these countries have had a lot of institutional continuity between state capitalism and neoliberalism, and then a return to state-led development. And so I think taking a more historical point of view, a historical perspective, we can actually understand state-led development as something that is a lot more permanent in models of governance, in models of development. In most parts of, in particular in middle-income countries, but I think increasingly we can also see this pattern of state-led and state-sponsored development coming back in debates in Western Europe, in the debate on industrial policy, on green industrial policy, and related debates. And so then it begs us the question, what do we then know about neoliberalism? What has neoliberalism done to countries that have implemented, that have embraced state capitalism as a model of development? What neoliberalism has done is it reformulated state capitalism. It reconstituted the institutional configuration, the scope of state intervention, the understanding of how the state, the role of the state in economic development. So let's take the case of state-owned enterprises. The idea of a state-owned enterprise back in the 70s is that the state has to own and manage the state company 100%. 30 years after, let's look at state-owned enterprises in Brazil, in China. One of the key characteristics of their SOEs is that they separated the management and the ownership of the company. So Petrobras remains to be predominantly owned by the Brazilian government, but they allow the CEO, they allow for the private shareholders to have some share and decision-making power as well. On state finance, one of the main conclusions back in the mid-2000s about South Korea's developmental state model has ended. It has been dismantled after restructuring. 2016, fast forward, Elizabeth Turban, one of the most prominent South Korean experts, argued in a book called Developmental Mindset. She said, no, in fact, if we look at how finance operates in Korea today, it simply reorganized finance. It simply enabled the state to own and control money and transfer financial capital and direct investment in the economy in a different way. So neoliberalism, what it did is it created competition. It emphasized global competitiveness. It emphasized the importance of export and technological innovation as a central objective. And state institutions then reformulated themselves in response to this new objective. So the nature of the state has changed under economic globalization. And so at the end of the day, what we'll see here is that state-led development is very present in these in different sectors of the economy. It's not the same as what we have seen back in the 60s, 70s. You know, it's not the same model where the state is the state is completely taking over industries and nationalizing. It's responded very differently in the conditions of economic globalization. But I think one of the main things we have to go beyond is the developmental state argument, because what it actually has done, the developmental state argument, essentially, what it has done is to highlight an alternative model of development beyond the regulatory state that we find in the Western world. As you know, a lot of this literature has emphasized the unique features, the regional contextual factors that allowed for the rapid sustained industrialization of 4 countries: South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, of course, but also Singapore, and then the Southeast Asian countries. That historical experience of countries in Asia, in East and Southeast Asia, enabled scholars to come up with what we call the developmental state framework, which is essentially about theorizing the active role of the state in economic development, in particular in industrial development. So when I speak about industrial development, what I mean here is the structural transformation of an economy, the creation of new sectors that is aimed at creating new comparative advantages for countries, for economies. Again, the classic example that we always use would be Korea, how it created a humongous manufacturing sector, you know, shipbuilding, cars, highly intensive, technology-intensive, capital-intensive sectors. And the basic argument of the developmental state framework is that some countries were very successful, middle-income countries were very successful at accelerating economic development, industrial transformation because of 3 things. A, that there's apparently an inclusive or a very mutually beneficial relationship between the states and businesses. B, that they've implemented a series of industrial policy instruments. So this can range from tax credits to export subsidies, so infant industry protection, different kinds of policy instruments in order to promote industrial production, in order to accelerate capital accumulation in chosen potential winning sectors of the economy. And finally, what is unique about the East Asian countries is that they have almost a Weberian German-style bureaucratic systems. And it is quite central. So if you think of Japan, for example, the model of developmental state back in the 60s for Korea, they've had a lead industrial planning agency, MIPI. And then Singapore has the same. They have a specialized board that is in charge of development planning. South Korea has the same. So bureaucratic autonomy, islands of bureaucratic efficiency that isolates technocrats from politics in order to promote industrial planning. Now, what happened after the 1990s? So what is, of course, ironic here is that once the developmental state framework was picking up and was becoming popular amongst academics, amongst intellectuals, the 1997 financial crisis happened. And So in fact, countries that were so successful, Thailand, South Korea, a lot of the Asian countries, they've been hit by the Asian financial crisis. It led to the collapse of regimes. It led to the full acceleration of a regime transition in some places. And in general, there is a sense that the developmental state is dead. And looking back at that historical period, we can argue that as early as 2001, 2002, there were already people who were saying the developmental state framework isn't very useful at all. But I think it's important to understand why the intellectual argument was disappearing in the mainstream debate. For one, it was because a lot of academics, a lot of policy in the policy circles, they thought that international financial institutions, particularly the IMF, was right in terms of its policy prescriptions in reformulating in recasting and in reconfiguring the Asian economy. So the Asian recovery strategy was essentially a neoliberal model. And so they argued that the DS framework doesn't make sense anymore. But also more critically, you have neoclassical economists, for example, Anne Kruger, who criticized heavily the developmental state model because they argue, well, it's crony capitalism, it's excessive state intervention, it's rent seeking. So you have these two dynamics happening in the 2000s that sort of delegitimized the developmental state framework as an idea of, as a way to organize your political economy models, as a way to organize state and market relations. And so I think over, if we push this forward 2010 onwards, and then we start seeing the rising importance of China, Vietnam, the return of state capitalism, the rise of sovereign wealth funds. The question then that comes to one's mind is, to what extent are these types of state intervention achieving structural transformation of the economy? So is industrial policy, is its objective still to transform industries, to move from one sector, one dominant sector of the economy into another? I want to point out sort of the parallel events that were taking place as this intellectual discussion was happening from mid-1990s, early 2000s. It is important to recognize that although it appeared to be that the developmental state idea was losing ground, it was losing in the battle of ideas. In fact, in reality, if we observe, the real world events, it's pointing us to a different direction. So the first thing that happened, of course, is that in particular, 1999 was a critical point. So if you remember, this was the Battle of Seattle, where activists went protesting against the WTO, and that sort of signaled the demise of the WTO multilateral trading system in 10 years' time. So this was quite an important challenge. Pressures from below, political challenges, political movements challenging the dominance of neoliberalism as an idea. So the collapse of what we call the Washington Consensus. But the second point, the second trend, I think, is more important. Not just, so the first point is more of the sort of the political movement taking place all over the world. The second point is, it has to do with the rise of China. That as China began to expand its economic engagement with the world, after it's underwent a process of gradual liberalization in the 90s, by 2000, 2001, we saw the rapid increase of China's presence across developing countries. So that was a significant moment because it also meant that foreign direct investment has started to move away from the developed countries. So there's now a movement of capital, foreign direct investment, from the developed to a large part of developing countries. Of course, there is a very uneven distribution here. East and Southeast Asia remain to be the region where they've attracted most of the FDI. And of course, we don't, this is something that we could easily imagine, that when Western companies, for example, started moving to Vietnam, to Thailand, to China by 2000. So this was quite an important moment because it actually meant that the movement of capital, investment patterns, and of course, what follows that would be infrastructure spending and everything, all the other economic activities, it's actually gradually moving away from the core economies of the global, of the world economy. This is actually more, this is marked by one important trend, which is that a lot of this FDI, because of Chinese and Indian demand for commodities, have started to pull capital and labor towards the natural resource sector. And just a point of reference, greenfield FDI is one of the basic measures of FDI projects, where money goes usually. Primary commodities from 2003 onwards remain to be the most important sector that drew in capital and labor. So growing importance of primary commodities, and it has increasingly become a new engine of economic growth. So if we think about Latin America, the growth period of Latin America from 2002 to 2012, this was primarily driven by commodity boom. In Africa, all the minerals the oil extraction that was taking place there, the investment poured in by China, these are all connected to the rising importance of primary commodities as a means to generate rents, as a means to generate surplus, and as a means of investment for these countries. Again, here there are quite big differences in regions and countries, but I think it is significant. It is a significant change, because if we think of 1980s and 1990s, we just have to remember Africa was considered to be the lost continent in the 1980s and 1990s. And then suddenly 2003, 2004, you have this massive inflow of FDI, particularly in the natural resource sector, and then subsequently in transport, in infrastructure, of course, everything driven by Chinese demand to have access to these resources. So then I think the debate on state capitalism makes sense if we contextualize the discussion in this way. Because of the rise of China, we have now seen variation in terms of how countries responded to the changing international context. So to understand, why Brazil has implemented new developmentalist policies, or sort of half resource-based, half industrial policy strategy, you have to understand the role of China in Brazil. The investments in Korea to accelerate science and technology intensive sectors, so biotech, robotics sector, these are critical strategic sectors that Korea in 2003 identified as its comparative advantage. This was a response to the threat of China. Well, so the Koreans have always seen itself in between China and Japan. So the rise of China and the reconfiguration of global and regional economic power is reshaping the state and the governance models that we find in developing countries and industrializing countries. Now, why did we decide to focus on industrial policy? I think one of the main reasons it's important to talk about industrial policy is because we have a lot of theories and concepts that we can draw from, but it doesn't actually specify enough, why some countries were able to sustain their development strategies and why others are not able to do so. So although industrial policy is part of the developmental state debate, I would argue it's actually different, because the most successful countries that have used industrial policy are developmental states, but it probably doesn't preclude the possibility of having industrial policy, even if you're not a fully developmental state. And again, here, one of the most interesting cases in the project is India, where it implemented extensive liberalization. The author, Dan Singh, he argues, of course, that India had a lot more difficulty implementing and succeeding in industrial policy because it just didn't have all the elements of a developmental state. But it did not preclude the possibility for India to pursue industrial strategies. So I think this is important. For countries, when they think about development strategies, when they think about how to respond to economic globalization, we need to be thinking in not just in terms of the broad state-market relations, but the policy instruments that are available and why under certain conditions these policies work for some countries and it doesn't work for others. By definition, industrial policy is a wide range of state instruments. So there is no one industrial policy. If we're going to look for a blueprint of an industrial policy, we're not going to find it. The Brazilian industrial policy is totally different from the Korean model. The Chinese are doing it completely different. But the point is, industrial policy is about utilizing the different policy instruments that are available for national elites that are aimed at supporting economic activities in order to support their domestic companies in the process of discovering new comparative advantages. And I think this is where it differs from the classic notion of comparative advantage under neoliberal and neoclassical economics. The idea here is that you use industrial policy in order to promote activities as a trial and error strategy to discover new comparative advantages. So there are two implications here. A, it implies that the old industrial policy that we know back in the 70s, they're not going to work under new conditions of economic globalization. So you need to discover a niche sector. You need to find a way in which you can find a competitive advantage for an economy. And so industrial policy is about thinking creatively the different instruments that are available for the state, whether it's subsidies or facilitating export market policy, or supporting certain industries, or strategic sectoral promotion. So there's no, as I said, there's no clear blueprint, but the idea is every government has several policy instruments that they can utilize and deploy in order to find ways to, create new comparative advantages for their national economies. And one of the recent studies that came out in world development is that, in fact, a lot of countries in the developing world had begun to implement national development plans. And this is quite a significant change. Again, the context is if you're reading a book that was published in 2007, 2008, they could not believe, that industrial planning is back in the agenda. But in fact, I think if we look more in a more long-term perspective, we take a more long-term perspective, we see that there is generally an increase in the number of development plans across different parts of the developing world. So one way in which Elizabeth Thurman and Linda Weiss conceptualized this is they made the distinction between the three different responses of countries to globalization. So one response is by Stephen Vogel in his book, Marketcraft. He characterizes one response as you basically set rules for market governance. You allow the market to operate. And so the idea is you support and you consolidate a regulatory state. Now, the standard sort of historical example of a regulatory state is the US. The typical policy instruments that they would use would be protecting intellectual property rights, financial regulation. So the idea is that you don't promote specific policies that support certain sector because that creates winners and losers in an economy. So the idea is you try to go as broad as possible and you allow the market to determine which sector, which firms will become competitive in the long run. The concept that they use in the book by Thurbine and Weiss is economic statescraft. And for them, this is slightly different from industrial policy because economic statescraft is about using strategic initiatives for promoting industrial development, but that these initiatives are motivated and are responses to an external environment. So again, here I think the distinction between industrial policy and economic statescraft is about where the pressure is coming from. In the traditional developmental state, the pressure could be from internal. So in the case of Korea, Korea was at the brink of a civil war. Korea was facing China, was facing Japanese competition. So there was a lot of pressure to develop. Economic development became a motor and source of legitimacy for the military government. Singapore is the same logic. A lot of the policies of Singapore, industrial policy of Singapore, back in the 60s and 70s was primarily driven by geopolitical insecurity. You know, they were kicked out by the Malaysian government. There was a sense of general insecurity during the Cold War period. And so there was a drive to use economic development to legitimize its existence as a state. Now, this is totally different from economic statescraft, which is about responding to an external, usually economic impetus, environment. But the focus is not the focus is to use policies towards the domestic arena. So I think here the difference is in an industrial policy, if you're implementing industrial policy, it doesn't always have to be focused on sector. It could also be thinking about, you know, trade and investment. So building regional trade arrangements. So this could be part of a bigger industrial policy. Economic statescraft for Thurbine and Weiss is specifically focused on the productive economy, the national economy. So it's much more inward looking in comparison to industrial policy. And they often use the case of South Korea versus the United States in terms of how economic statescraft is used. Now, I mean, there is a lot of debate here. This is one way to organize the concepts in the literature, but I think to me what it does, and you know, as I said, there are more similarities between economic statescraft and industrial policy. But to me, what it does signal is we need to pay more attention to the micro level political and economic dynamics that are taking place. So meso level analysis as opposed to just looking at the state and the market in the broader sense. One of the reasons I think that we need to think about industrial policy is because it allows us to explain different aspects of how a state responds to an external context. And in particular, in this project, we emphasize three things: the design of the industrial policy, the ways in which they negotiate the institutional arrangement between the state and the business sector, and its consequences for economic competitiveness. And so when we think about industrial policy, we think about three things, basically. First, we need to be able to identify, you know, what is the vision or the strategic orientation of the state? Does it even exist? And I think here you can really see the big difference between a neoliberal state and a developmental state. In a neoliberal state, the orientation of is to promote, you know, competitiveness, but the state withdrawing itself from setting policy objectives. So the objective is to allow the market to operate. So very similar to Vogel's concept of market craft. In an industrial policy, it is essential that the state has a clear vision of where it wants to be. So you're not going to put in place interventionist policies without a clear idea where it's going to end. So you're not going to invest in the nuclear sector if you don't know what kind of industries will come out of it. So the strategic orientation of the state is really central here. China is one of the most visible examples here. The way in which China decides which sectors to liberalize and which sectors to support. It's very clear that for China, certain sectors need to be strategic, need to be under the control of the state. Certain sectors, they will allow the private sector to operate. So very clear idea of where the state is placed within, the continuum. The second is this concept of constructive contestation comes from what's her name? From a book, in fact, and it's basically about the process of negotiation between the public and the private. And this you can, of course, you can interpret it in different ways. It could be negotiations between different sets of economic actors in the state. It could be between the state enterprise and the private sector, depending on the configuration of the national economy. But one of the most observable manifestation of these contestation is what kind of institutional arrangements exist between the state and the private sector, between the public, the state company and the other private companies. And so I think one of the most important aspects here is to understand why, is to be able to identify why some countries, for example, they prefer to have coordinate what do you call, like business associations, highly coordinated business associations, whereas other countries prefer to go, a firm to the state, firm to state level negotiation. So different institutional arrangements. And then finally, it's about the range of policy instruments in order to implement and effect these changes. So if you put together these three things, that I think is what really constitutes an industrial strategy. And this is why, if you cannot see these three elements, in a case that you're looking at, it's much harder to argue that they actually have an industrial strategy, or at least you could say it has a partial industrial strategy, or it has an incoherent industrial policy. So I think this is where you can see the differentiation between cases, between countries that have implemented industrial policies. And to some extent, I think it really almost signals as well the answer to the question, why has it failed? Because without a strategic vision, for example, your range of policy instruments will remain incoherent. Without the proper institutional arrangement between the public and the private, it's impossible to lay out and implement your strategic vision. So you need to have these three things lined up together. This is a simple summary of what you find in the literature in terms of what influences industrial policy and industrial strategy. I talked about the state vision, the state orientation, but also you can include there the capacity, the bureaucratic competence of the state. So that's more like a structural aspect of the state. So not just the political leadership. The second is, it refers basically to what I talked about, the constructive contestation. You need to look at, the extent to which business groups are able to mobilize themselves. How coherent are the interests of the firms? And then the other factor that I didn't discuss a while ago, but I think could, in some instances influence industrial policy is the market and geopolitical conditions. As I said, this was quite significant for the success of East Asian developmental states. So there is a whole debate around, whether the political and economic conditions today are still conducive for industrialization or industrial strategy of countries. Now let's take just a very quick look at two cases here. What are the main lessons we can draw from the Brazilian experience of industrial policy? One of the things, I guess, that people have always forgotten when they look at Brazil is it has had a successful phase of industrialization. We have to remember back in the 1930s, the two main exports of Brazil was sugar and coffee. So the success of Brazil is that by the end of the 1970s, Brazil had a world-class aeronautics industry. Embraer is one of the biggest airplane design companies in the world. The agricultural sector of Brazil is the first, if not the second, most important agricultural producer in the world. Its oil and gas sector, Petrobras, is considered to be one of the most important companies involved in offshore technology, in offshore ultra deep water drilling technology. renewable sector. Brazil has very big bioethanol and renewable sector that allows it to move, to have a cleaner energy matrix by far, and if we compare to other countries. A lot of these sectoral promotion policies took place because there was a centralized industrial policy backed by a very clearly outlined financing mechanism, which is through the Brazilian Development Bank. So here, I think where I want to draw out, the most important part of the success of Brazil's early industrialization is that its strategic vision was coupled with very, very clear institutional arrangements, and at the same time, very clear policy instruments. So this is the point where you can see this alignment between these three different components. In the 1990s, as economic globalization accelerated, one of the main problems that Brazil had faced, as with many developing countries, is how to liberalize their market economies, how to open the sector, which sectors to open. And the 1990s, for a lot of Brazilian political economists, is characterized as unfettered and unstoppable liberalization of the Brazilian economy. But in fact, I think what's interesting in the period of the 1990s, it wasn't so much that there was widespread, total, complete liberalization. But I think what was lost in the 1990s was a developmental alliance between the industrial elites in Brazil and the state. And the kind of cohesion that was there under the military government disappeared. So one of the main reasons why Brazil had struggled to come back and implement a more cohesive industrial policy under Lula was that he could not recreate that industrial alliance with the industrial elites of the south of Brazil. And so, looking back, the success, the second phase of economic miracle in Brazil, the period of 2000 where they had modest growth rates, it was pretty much based on natural resources. It's exporting commodities, soya, mining, to some degree, the oil and gas, sector was booming at the expense of the industrial manufacturing sector. So one of the key reasons, I think, why Brazil is struggling to put together a more cohesive industrial policy today is because that coherent alliance with the industrial sector disappeared from the 1990s, and they can't there's just no way that they're able to recreate or reconfigure that. And in fact, they did, and that ended up becoming one of the most infamous example of corruption. So there was a coalition under Lula, and that became known as the Lava Jato scheme. It ended up as predatory capitalism as opposed to more developmentally oriented alliance that you find in Korea or in Singapore and in other Asian examples. India is an excellent example because it failed in promoting industrial production despite all the positive contextual and initial conditions. So one of the most interesting figures that I don't work on India at all, but one of the most interesting data that I found here is that despite sustained effort of the Indian government to support manufacturing, they've actually decreased from 16.2 to 15.8%. So this is actually a case where despite a lot of effort on industrial policy, it has failed. The argument that Dan was making in his paper is that unlike Brazil and China, where you see this strategic policy and strategic decision-making by the state, India has influenced patterns of capital and investment in the country, but in a non-strategic fashion. It was much more ad hoc, it was much more temporary, and there was no strategic vision in terms of how to direct capital and investment towards the potentially winning sectors of the economy. And he argues in this paper that the core capacities of the state to direct and discipline the industry are substantially weaker than in Korea or Brazil. Now, I think this is one of the most interesting findings that we have in the previous book on developmental states beyond East Asia. One of the things that we really looked into is, why is it that Korea, which has so much corruption, is able to implement industrial policy, and why do other countries keep failing? Alice Amsden, in her book on Korea, she argued that there is a sort of there is a principle of reciprocity that is ingrained in Korea's industrial policy. What this means is that the Korean state implements a carrot and stick mechanism. So I will give you all the subsidy that you need and support, but you have to support the government. You have to support the government, but also you have to export. You have to meet certain targets. And vice versa, the Korean companies, the chaebols, they were supporting the state. They were supporting in order to ensure political stability, so the government has continuity. So one of the key successes of Korea was this mutually reinforcing relationship between the state and the business. In the case of India, this was not. His argument is that this was not present at all, or at least minimal. He looked at the pharmaceutical industry and the automotive sector for comparison. Brazil, to some extent, has that success, as I said, under the military government, quite problematic under the Lula government because of the difficulty in responding to the external context that Brazil was situated in around in the period of 2000. And finally, and I think this is one of the most, again, one of the most interesting issues that a lot of political economists face, is how do you solve the electoral imperative? Because one of the main, so if we think of industrial policy, I mean, of course, it's a strategic policy, but ultimately it's a redistributive mechanism of the state. It's essentially the state distributing rents. The success of Brazil and Korea, arguably, was because it was centralized. And it was centralized because it was a military government. But post-1990, when all of these countries have begun to democratize, how do you deal with the electoral pressures? There's a lot of pressure to distribute these rents unproductively in order to respond to the different demands from different sectors of society, from different business groups. So in many cases, electoral imperatives don't align very well with industrial policy objectives. And the reason behind this is because industrial policy requires a long-term horizon. So there's a temporal question here. If you succumb to electoral incentives, you may be making decisions on the basis of what's good now and the next 5 years. But that might not be good from the point of view of industrialization, which will require you to think about what's going to happen within the 20-year period. So there's a temporality question here. And I think India was one of the good examples that demonstrate this difficulty of dealing with long-term incentives versus short-term benefits that you can distribute amongst different parts of society in order to maintain your coalition, your governing coalition. So what I'll do is I'll end by posing you more questions and challenges. But I think so this is one of the most interesting reasons to study, one of the biggest reasons to study state capitalism and industrial policy in the next 10 years. A, because we know certain things, such as we need a mechanism for financing industrial policy, but there's no blueprint for it. You have so many different models. Brazilian model is development bank. The US model is venture capital schemes. Some countries rely on commercial loans. Or in the African case, Ethiopia, Rwanda, these are countries that are more reliant on Chinese loans and Chinese FDI. So different ways to finance your industrial policy, there are pros and cons, and we don't have a mechanism. We have no intellectual consensus on which one works best and under what conditions. Second is, because now we are at a point where global market integration is irreversible, there is a conflict over whether to promote local capital marketing facilities, whether to support domestic capital, or should we create an institutional environment, a policy package where we will promote FDI. Of course, what we want to say is we can do both. But the reality is there's fundamentally a conflict here, because If you rely on foreign capital, they have technology, but they may not be willing to share this technology. On the other hand, with local capital, you need to develop the know-how, you need to develop the expertise, you need to find the comparative advantage of your domestic companies. And that's a hard process, and very few countries have been successful in doing that. Third, and this goes back to the sectoral question, if manufacturing is not viable anymore because of China, because of India, because of Vietnam, what is left for other countries? And I think here this question becomes important depending on the income level of the country. So again, I think the point my colleague has pointed out, if Nigeria would achieve the level of economic development and the sophistication of the export sector of Brazil, maybe that's good enough for Nigeria. Similarly, the problem of Brazil is that it wants to go beyond being a middle income country. So the challenges are different. It then has to think about the different sectors that they might be able to be competitive in the future. And then finally, the question of how you deal with the green transition. In the European context, this was sort of resolved, quote unquote, through the Green Deal, that EU will start investing in technologies and they will start to make sure that, we move towards cleaner forms of extraction, cleaner forms of manufacturing. Whether this is going to happen for other countries is a big question. I think what's interesting, though, as a final point here, is countries like China and South Korea have already invested 20 years ago on green technology. The reason why solar panels and wind turbines are much cheaper today is because there was a lot of investment, and they made sure, China made sure that they would be able to make it cheaper for us to use this to sell it in the global market. The project that I'm going to work on rare metals, one of the most interesting part of that project is the green industrial policy. And I think one of the main reason I'm really curious to look at is if the transition is going to happen, because we think we need to move towards a climate-friendly policy, we have no blueprint, and we only have expectations of how this green industrial policy would look like. And yet some countries were actually further ahead already in that sense. Like China has, the reason why China can promise to lower its carbon emissions in 2050 is because it actually has a plan in place. Brazil can achieve a cleaner environmental matrix because it has always been less reliant on coal and oil and gas for its energy needs. So I think what's going to be interesting is how you incorporate these climate pressures on climate, pressure to respond to climate change towards creating a new industrial policy in order to, have a more sustainable development model in the future. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jewellord. That was very interesting. Great insight on development economics. And now we open the floor for questions. Who wants to be the first? We can collect groups of 2 questions. I believe we can collect some online. 2, 3 questions.
How do we get the online?
There are resources.
Oh.
There are resources. Before it was easier. Perhaps 3 we can get as well. But who wants to start?
Can perhaps stop the
presentation so you can see the people. And now people who want to come out will say hello, I believe. But people in the room? Ricardo, we have a question. Ricardo? Anyone else want to start? So I'll give the floor to Ricardo. Perhaps I move the camera and I'll make myself the
cameraman.
The cameraman and the director.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering to what extent can we talk about the failure of India to industrialize, because you use the share of manufacturing in GDP. but this is a period in which India actually grew a lot, grew very fast, which means that a slight reduction of manufacturing GDP probably means that manufacturing in India grew quite fast in this period, in real terms, in absolute terms. And we know that there are some areas in which this was actually quite successful. And then there is also the issue, the obvious issue that if one thinks about where India made a clear bet on development of productive capacity, we will think about software production, which is not classified as manufacturing.
Yeah.
And I cannot really think about industrial policy in the 21st century without considering some services, which are actually a way to, as you said, the state fostering new comparative advantage or competitive advantages, or whatever you want to call them. And then also thinking about the Brazilian case in the turn of the century, it is true, of course, that there was a regression in industrialization in the sense that natural resources became a main source of income for Brazilian capitalists. But how is this related to an incapacity of the state to make some kind of agreement with the private sector? Because in my view, what happened there is that it became too much profitable to sell natural resources and minerals and agricultural products, etc., to China instead of producing manufacturing. And in my view, the state and the private sector actually were quite active collaborating in this turn towards natural products in Brazil. So I wouldn't say that it is a matter of either lack of vision or a matter of lack of collaboration between the private and public sector. I would say that the main interests were pointing towards a different pattern of development.
Anyone else wants to make a comment?
Can I make a question?
Okay, yes, sure. By the online.
Okay. Okay. So thank you very much for the presentation. It was very clear and interesting for me. But I was wondering if, because you focus very much in national states, and I would like to know, how do you articulate your research with the global dynamics of capitalism, and where I suppose there is a hierarchy of power, finance, and knowledge. And so I think that today, maybe it's not enough to just analyze national states, but how do we integrate these in a wider dynamic of power? Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you very much for your question. I think now I can pass to Jojo to start replying.
Yeah. So the first answer to the India question is I can send you the paper on India because that is a full paper that's written, and it has all the details. And as I said, the cases that was looked in India was automotive and pharmaceutical, and then it was sort of comparative. But I think, so to me, the starting point is what is a debate on what do we mean by industrial policy and what is industrialization. Because so the traditional definition is structural transformation, which means you actually expect a transition from one sector, from one dominant sector to the next. So a lot of the papers in the special issue were essentially, we zeroed in on this question on, are we seeing transformative changes in the national economy of the countries that we're looking at, or are we seeing changes in the sector, in different sectors? because this is quite an important analytical starting point. If industrial policy, if we accept that industrial policy needs to create structural transformation, then our evaluation and measurement of success would be different. And so in this paper, for example, Dan's argument is that you have to measure industrial policy on its ability to deliver manufacturing. So that's how I would answer that question. I do take this same viewpoint in a sense, because I think the history of economic development is the history of creating, expanding the productive sector of the economy. And if we look at the different sectors of the economy, the sector that has the most multiplier effect, the widely accepted story of structural transformation is an emphasis on manufacturing. And so I think in that sense, if the measure is that we don't see a dramatic increase in the share of manufacturing in an economy, then using that measure, then it has failed. So to me, that would be my answer. Having said that, that does not preclude the argument we're making, which is, what if India is able to generate a new comparative advantage in a sector? And I think this leads to my second point, which is, in some cases, maybe industrial policy should be understood simply as sectoral promotion. And in that sense, then India is successful. And in that sense as well, you could also say Chile has a minimal state approach to industrial policy, and it's successful because it's able to expand from copper mining to other natural resources. It has basically diversified its export basket. So again, I think there is I wouldn't say a measurement question, but a criteria question. What do you consider to be industrial policy? What should be its objective? And then measure based on that qualification, or based on that criteria, you have to then make a decision based on the data that you see. So in that sense, to me, a higher, more difficult threshold would be the structural transformation. Sort of the minimum kind of level or criteria would be, you have to have some sectoral development. There has to be some kind of new comparative advantage, or the creation of new competitive advantages in the economy.
Yeah, sorry, I was precisely thinking that if I pick up the definition you give in the beginning of what industrial policy is, you focus on precisely finding new sources of competitive advantage.
Yeah.
And this, it doesn't square very much to me with your idea of the multiplier effects of the industrial sector, because it might be the case that you have absolutely no competitive advantage or comparative advantage whatsoever in industrial manufacturing, and you're still arguing that you should promote industrial development because of multiplier effect. So what you're saying is that you want to promote a sector, a group of industries in which you do not have competitive advantage, but you still have to promote them, you want to promote them due to their multiplier effect. So I think there is some intention in the definition you used in the beginning and the reasoning you follow now.
So I think this is where because it's a special issue, we also allow the people to make that decision of how. So I put the standard, which is the minimum standard, is that it has to create new comparative advantages. I think that the papers differed in terms of how they actually, so to me, I started by saying, to me, the definition is that there has to be some degree of competitive advantage or creation of new comparative advantage. But, some people they want a much higher threshold. So to me, that's also, I think it's because it's not a single authored monograph. So that I think that's the difficulty. Which I think leads to the next question you have on, how you explain the Brazilian case. And this I can answer because I work in Brazil. To me, there's two moving pieces of the puzzle here. One is, of course, if the economic incentives is for you to specialize on natural resources, then it's very likely that countries would, or that that firms would follow because that's where it's most profitable. And that's really what happened in Brazil, which is that because of the commodity boom, because there's so much export revenues you can make from soya and iron, then it completely makes sense for Lula to support the the agribusiness sector, for example. I think there is a section amongst the Brazilian industrial elites, and in particular the Sao Paulo group, were very critical of Lula's industrial policy because they say it's actually not an industrial policy. How could it be an industrial policy if you're not supporting the industries that are losing because of its competition with China, that are losing because the government policy is to support export promotion of commodities? Now, I do take the point, and I think you're right about this, that it is very likely that the Brazilian industrial policy will not be the industrial policy they had in the 1970s. The future industrial policy will be resource-based, precisely because it appears that a lot of the investment in Brazil in the past, since the 1990s, has been in the natural resource sector. And so there's a path-dependent logic here. If the state has invested its policy instruments towards the natural resource sector, it doesn't make sense to switch back to manufacturing and save the electronics sector, for example, which is what they did in the 70s. So the electronics industry, that's not going to happen in Brazil. But you could expect innovation in the oil and gas. You could find manufacturing, equipment and services in deep water engineering. So one of the key industrial policy instruments of Lula is local content. He wanted the domestic engineering services in Brazil, the offshore services, those who provide services to Petrobras, to Shell, to be Brazilian, and that was all his industrial policy. There's a debate on whether that was successful or not, but I think, to me, this is a clear case where there is some element of the idea of the old idea of manufacturing being important still as a part of industrial policy, but also a recognition that Brazil's political economy at the moment is going to be resource-based. And so if you look at who succeeded in the past 20 years, 2000 onwards, under the PT, they're all natural resource-based companies. So food processing, again, Vale, the next generation of industrial policy will be on rare minerals, on renewable energy. These are all still related to the natural resource sector. So I think what's going to happen is we may need to rethink about, I don't think we can expect the structural transformation that we found back in the 70s in Brazil. Also because it's going to have to be just about technological upgrading and dominating the supply chain. And that's one. The second is that the challenge is to put a brake on the deindustrialization, because one of the key problems of a resource-oriented economy is that it just doesn't employ as much labor. And for big countries, you need employment-generating sectors, and manufacturing still remains to be that. I do think you're right about the services. Then it begs the question, what kind of services are we talking about then? Are we going to see a transition from lower value chain, lower service sector to more higher service sector? So are we going to see more sophisticated banking and finance in Brazil? So I actually don't know the answer, but what I can see is it's going to be export-based, it's going to be natural resources, technology intensive. I don't know if they can meet the criteria on how to address the employment question. So the last interview I did in Brazil, this was the same question that I asked to the Ministry of Industrial Planning, and she said exactly that question. She said, we don't know whether we will be able to solve the employment question. And that's also a political question rather than just an industrial policy question. On the final question about the, why we focus on the national state, my answer to that is, I think we need to see how national industrial policy is contextualized and then link it to the global value chains. So to me, there's a lot of work on industrial policy. Now, one of the papers we have in the special issue is about the incompatibility between regional integration and national industrial policy instruments in Africa. Again, I think what's interesting here is the global value chains, the supply chain that we have today is fragmented. And we're not going to see a single country dominating the supply chain. So the industrial strategy has to be about trying to extend as much as you can, the amount of competence that you have across the supply chain. So in the case of Brazil, for example, the renewable energy, they know they have a competitive advantage in the renewable energy because they've been doing renewable energy since the 1970s. But they don't know yet whether they could be the dominant supplier of renewable energy. So industrial policy for the future will have to be figuring out what kind of policy instruments will support renewable energy in such a way that Brazil becomes competitive vis-a-vis the United States for renewable energy, vis-a-vis China, where China is also now heavily investing on renewable energy. So it's really a question of where you find your competitive advantage vis-a-vis the other players in the market.
Thank you very much, Jojo. We have, Jewellord, we have two questions, online questions, one from Cristina Pinheiro and another one from Nuno Bento, but I'll give the word first. Then Luis Carvalho will have another one.
Yeah.
Okay, but I'll give word first to Cristina. She was the first to raise her hand online. Cristina, are you listening to us?
Yeah.
Okay.
Professor, thanks a lot. Is it me? Did I understand it correctly?
Sorry? See, it's you.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so political economy theory and all this conceptual interpretation of the developmental process always sounds very advanced and persuasive, but my curiosity is, what about empirical research? So in your experience, how difficult is it to conduct empirical research to collect robust empirical evidence on a phenomenon that is so complex, no? So many factors at play, like political regimes, ideology, geopolitics, knowledge, technology, and so on. I mean, you have these classics that you refer to, and I see them quoted everywhere, like Amsden, Johnson, Wade, in particular. No, they are quite formidable case studies of the Asian miracles, and I never see anything else quoted to that extent. So is this somehow a gap in the empirical research? Why are these studies so? I mean, I know they are remarkable, but why are they the only ones remarkable? Is there something missing here? Is there a reason why we don't see other works of this magnitude? And is it even possible to conduct empirical research on industrial policy with the similar level of robustness on comparative grounds, so comparing different countries, or is this only feasible if you focus on one national reality? This is my question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And now I have to pass the word to Nuno Bento, and then I'll pass to Luis Carvalho.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Three very rapid questions. First, is there a relationship, according to your analysis, did you find a relationship between the industrial policy intervention and the good industrial policy and the development stage of the country? So is there a kind of balance in the beginning? Is better to have more centralized and then less centralized? That's the first question. Second question is about the beyond manufacturing. Have you already studied the case of Germany? Because Germany actually developed a lot with the manufacturing in the past 20 years. So it's interesting after also the reunification to see, well, maybe the manufacturing can also be a strategy. Third and last question is about the Green New Deal. Is that the Green New Deal one of the reasons why the industrial policies becoming too fashion, because this is an externality. And anyway, you know, from the neoclassics, we know that with externalities, the state must intervene. And if yes, how would you pick sectors for the structural transformation? So these are my three questions about the relationship, about manufacturing, and about the externality and picking sectors. Just a final note, it's about the solar PV in China. Actually, there are lots of literature, but in the energy and technology side, which actually shows that what happened was not really driven by domestic kind of money, was more driven by demands from Germany that pushed the industry of Chinese solar PV. So that's a kind of a small note, but thank you very much. Very interesting talk.
Thank you for your question, Nuno. And now I'll pass the word to Luís Carvalho.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you are listening well. Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate you for your excellent and extremely interesting presentation. Also to congratulate the organizers for bringing development issues to this discussion. Presently, I am Director of Development Studies Master Program here there at ISCTE. So it's very pleasant to see development coming back to the center of our intellectual debate. I have mainly two observations. I would have a third one, but you already, in your reply, somehow addressed it. So the first thing is about your story, let's say, regarding the critique of the developmental state. And I think, but probably it was a misinterpretation of me. But I think you suggested that there was a dominant interpretation of the Korea case, for instance, as a developmental state, and then the neoliberal critique started after the crisis. But in fact, this is an ongoing debate, because at the beginning, neoliberals like Anne Kruger and others argued that Korea, because it was export-oriented, was following the Washington Consensus. Then came a fringe literature, which was Alice Amsden, Wade, and etc., which said, no, this is not the Washington Consensus. It was the East Asian Miracle Report of the World Bank in '93, sponsored by Japan, which was, the conclusions were somehow washed in order to be not to a developmental state, the story. And then only in 1970, they came back and say, no, this is chronic capitalism, and this is very bad because it was development-led. So it's more complicated a bit, the story. Then I would like to congratulate you for your very clear presentation of the Brazil case, and very interesting. As you may imagine, Brazil is a very important case for us Portuguese, so we follow very closely and are closely interested in Brazil. And I think you pointed rightly to a major failure of Lula's government and PT's government, which was precisely the economic failure. There was a moral failure related to corruption, but it was there was a social success, but there was an economic failure, and it was precisely this model. Okay, and I think that this is you argue that they may construct a future strategy related to natural resources. Probably there's probably the option, but this was an extractivist strategy, and clearly linked with openness to China. So my question is, and to an alignment in geopolitical terms of Brazil with China, with Russia, and with India. My question is, if you see now, since now we are in a different political framework, would this continue to be so? Would Brazil still pay its homage to China, to Russia, and to India, or will it realign itself? And if then, would it not be possible to reconstruct a more manufacturing-oriented strategy for Brazil, since Brazil has technical capacity to do so? Okay, technical capacity is there. They can build everything from a space, from a satellite to a shoe. Well, the other issue was global value chains, but you already addressed
Yeah.
You can answer.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the questions. I will try to put together the answer to some of the questions that overlap. So,
Look, it's not on. Okay.
yeah.
The director.
So I will start with the first question on sort of the intellectual debate around developmental state. Why do we still cite Robert Wade and Alice Amsden? I think because there's still the classic works that really captures what a developmental state is. And if we, and I am a believer that, you know, you want to be faithful to the foundations. So I you know, if you want to study, for example, linkage, you have to start with Hirschman. It doesn't mean that there's not been a lot of great works afterwards. As I said, Elizabeth Thurbon had the book on the developmental mindset, and she looked at the transformation of finance in Korea from 1990s all the way to 2016. There is a book by I can't remember his first name, Wong, 2011, on biotech. But I think the point is that these are, we all have to start with an understanding why East Asian countries were able to achieve what they have achieved. And I think that has to do with the fact that even with the measure, the high measure that we use, which is, you know, structural transformation, Korea did it in 50 years, which a lot of countries could not replicate. And without ascribing to a blueprint, without actually thinking that we need to follow what Korea did, because we know history matters, contextual differences, you know, political legacies matter. I think there are certain elements of that governance model that resonate very strongly to contemporary development issues. If we look, so if I just pick in that special issue we did on developmental states beyond East Asia, Ethiopia is an example of a rising developmental state, so to speak. It was written by Christopher Clapham. He's one of the experts on Ethiopia. And he makes that point, which is the reason why Ethiopia can build an insulated bureaucracy is because it has a long history of statehood. You know, you don't start from scratch. You build on the political institutions that you have. You operate on whatever institutional arrangements are there. Same answer I would think about Brazil. Why, you know, Brazil has manufacturing capacity. That's why they can use their manufacturing capacity and promote offshore technology in oil and gas. So, you know, if you have oil like Venezuela, you become an oil export. They became oil exporters. They exported oil. That's what they did. Brazil decided they will emphasize technology on equipment and services alongside extraction of oil. So it's about understanding how the nature of the state, and that nature of state has changed over, you know, over several decades, I think. So I really think that there are certain elements in the historical examples of East Asia, and we can build on some of these elements. And so I think that's what's important when we sort of think about the concepts and how we use those concepts. On the question of how you pick comparisons, or so I don't think I advocate for case necessarily that you pick a case and then you study the case and you sort of unpack the case. A lot of the work that I've done, the one in Germany, the ERC project, these are all comparative approaches, because I think what's important is to be able to draw out some context-specific comparisons. And what I mean here is you can hold certain things constant between countries when you compare them. There's no two country that's perfectly comparable. We think Bolivia and Ecuador are perfectly comparable because of so many things that are similar, but they're completely different countries. And so I think it is about methodologically thinking through what is the research question that you're asking and how are your comparisons going to address how will the comparison answer the question that you're posing. So to me, yeah, you definitely want to do more comparative work on this. And the reason why I prefer doing special issue is because you can actually draw out expertise from people who work on single cases and force them to think more comparatively. So to me, that's the value of these kinds of projects that I do. On the question about the learning, on Germany, of course, the developmental state debate is preceded by Germany. The Japanese model of the Meiji Restoration, the Meiji Reform in Japan was patterned after the German, the intellectual, the intellectual reading of Friedrich List. The Japanese bureaucracy was patterned after the German model. So I think the Japanese learned a lot from the Germans, and there is that long history, in that period that we always forget. But that preludes all this debate on the developmental state. And so I think there is that lineage. So if you do like history of state-led development, you start with Germany and you move forward. And you will see that, similar dynamics that we observe in countries like Germany and Japan, and then the East Asian countries. And then now you have China, Vietnam, and the Southeast Asian countries. So there's sort of an intellectual legacy there. The issue on the new Green Deal, I found this completely interesting because I've always, as a non-EU citizen living in Europe, I've always sort of looked at Europe as a neoliberal fortress. And so it's super interesting to me that a lot of questions that have been asked in development studies on the role of the state, industrial policy, they're all coming out now on the question of climate change, on the question of COVID, for example. So I think there is a lot of fruitful research that we will be able to see in the next 10 years, looking into a renewed role of the state. I also think that part of that intellectual debate has to do with the fact that austerity politics have failed in a lot of places in Europe. And we're now at a point we're trying to look for a model. We're trying to look for ways to adjust to that reality. And of course, the looming presence of China. There is the rise of China is a very important historical moment, not just in terms of what it offered to a lot of developing countries, to Africa, to Latin America. I mean, it's changed the dynamics on foreign aid, it's changed trade patterns, it's changed, rentier politics in Venezuela. But what it did in Africa in particular is that it provided them with sort of a model. So you've got actually Africanists and African policymakers learning on how to do industrial policy. This is new. I think I've not seen this dynamics in the policy world where people from Africa, they would go to Singapore to study the board, the investment more that Singapore did. They would study industrial policy of China and South Korea. So I think we are seeing a trend where state capitalism is here more prominently in the mainstream debate. I don't think we will see sort of a replacement because, neoliberalism is there. It's ingrained in the world order, And I think what we'll see is geo-economic, geopolitical narrative and competing narratives on how do you do development. You will find good examples of market-led development. Chile is an excellent example of how neoliberalism has succeeded in terms of producing growth. It's very bad in inequality, but produced growth, produced export competitive sectors. And on the other end of the spectrum, you will have countries like Brazil, you will have countries like Vietnam, where you have state-led development taking a much more central role in policy making. On the last set of questions, yeah, I completely agree on your critique on the narrative on the developmental state. It does, as I said, there's a long sort of intellectual story there, and I completely agree with what you described. Anne Kruger was there in 1974 arguing that it wasn't the state that created Korea of what Korea is. So that's a historical debate that's there. So I'm sorry that I skipped that. And then I think the question on, I don't want to be very speculative on Brazil, but I think what's interesting at the moment is, so I'm finishing a book on Brazil and Chile, and I finished the Brazil chapters, and where I ended up is almost, it's kind of a pessimistic ending, in fact, but it's about sort of whether the Brazilian State Developmental Alliance has been dismantled, or has it been dismantling in the context of the right in power. And whenever I face this question, I almost get reminded of the literature of the 90s when people started writing about Cardoso. And my Brazilian friend, an economist, reminded me that, the thing about the state in Brazil is that we think it disappears, but it's somewhere there. And so I think the Brazilian strategy, we don't know what it's going to look like under Bolsonaro and whoever comes after, but it's very hard to take the state out. I think the future strategy would still be on more state-led development in some form or another. What's interesting, though, about Brazil and China in particular, the relationship, and this is the same friend who said to me, what's the difference between Brazil and Europe as they relate to China? China knows that Brazil is its biggest food supplier, so it has a very different relationship with China. And in that sense, countries that understand what their comparative advantages, what their competitive advantages, countries that know what they have that others don't, and if they can use that towards some clear developmental objective, I think that's gonna matter in terms of your negotiating power, in terms of how you deal with, how you craft trade deals, in terms of how you will negotiate a regional alliance or an interregional alliance. And I think there are some elements of this that have been demonstrated in Brazil. So Brazil was very good in the WTO negotiations. I know some Brazilianists would always say that Brazil could have done more vis-a-vis China. But I think that, in fact, that Brazil has this ability to be able to manage its relationship with China, I think quite positively. And Brazil lost in some instances, particularly in manufacturing. There's a lot of data showing that the deindustrialization of Brazil, of course, it's not because of China, but part of that reason is that China had an important role to play in the deindustrialization process. It's, exports of Brazil, they were just shifting to resources. So in the end, I think you will see a more sort of mixed picture between Brazil and China. It'll be interesting also because the Chinese state is changing its direction, and we will know. The ERC project I'm working on, one of the three cases I'm doing is Brazil, China, and Kazakhstan. So I'll come back maybe in 3 years and tell you what's in there in that relationship.
Thanks. You can get the preliminary conclusions. Any more questions? So online, Ricard? Yes, sure.
I don't have a question of my own, but I would like to challenge you to try to address the concern, the existential concern that is behind Christina's question, which can be quite typical of a PhD student who is at the stage of trying to decide what his or her project will be. And as I understood it, maybe Christina can clarify it, but as I understood it, a question about the classicals of developmental state literature was not so much why should we still be reading Armstrong or Wade, but it's something else. It's at what extent, I mean, what are the methodological challenges behind this attempt to deal with such a complex issue of such as the political economy of development, right? So typically in a positivistic world, we are looking for ways to estimate precisely the causes and the effects. And those that who have an economic background, they are used to use econometrics and such more quantitative and statistically sophisticated methods. And usually political economy approaches or institutional ones don't do it. They look for more qualitative material, and still there is this issue of how to make casual claims about what you're researching.
Okay, I get it.
I think it would be interesting for you, given the fact that you're talking to a lot of PhD students who are in that difficult phase. It would be interesting to say some words about that.
So I think what I can say, I could discuss the process of how I choose cases. I think so. To me, maybe this is a much easier way to do it. And tomorrow, of course, we'll have a whole session on case selection and comparative designs. So when I did the ERC project, I mean, I always start with the question of what do I want to find out? What exactly do I want to know? So in this ERC project, I was very interested in the question of industrial policy and whether you can find ways where you can use mineral mining as a way to promote economic development. But in particular, can you link mining to manufacturing, which is sort of the big debate on the resource-based growth development. And then what I decided is, let me pick 3 countries that have some interest on mining, they have some degree of manufacturing, and let's look at whether they have different models. So what I did is I picked China because I know China is an important country that has the reserves of mine. So I'm looking at rare earth metals. These are minerals that you use in cell phones, computers, wind turbines. So strategic minerals. So I picked China because it's the biggest supplier, but also that they actually thought about the importance of compelling multinational companies to move into China to produce them domestically. So that's model A. Model A is highly interventionist state. And then I picked Brazil because I thought, well, Brazil has a long history of resource nationalism. It has a history of industrial policy, similar to China, but there's one crucial difference with Brazil, which is they're also more accommodating to foreign capital. They don't necessarily just shun away foreign capital. So that's model 2. And then I picked model 3, which is, let's look at a country where it's got a lot of these minerals as well, but they're entirely dependent on foreign capital. And so in that case, it's Kazakhstan. The mining sector, the rare metals industry is reliant on joint ventures from Japanese capital. So what I wanted to do in this project is to ask myself, will it make a difference that you have these 3 different models, in terms of how you can link mining to manufacturing? And so the basic idea is you pick 3 different, you hold certain things constant amongst the range of cases that you can choose from. And based on that, you start thinking, what would be the intellectual benefit, of picking 2 similar cases versus picking 3 cases where you actually have different processes. So for political economy projects, what's important for us is, because we're not in the business of measuring things in the most precise terms. We're more interested in the political process, on the institutions. And so to me, I thought, then we should look at 3 different ways in which this process can be observed. So that's what I did in that kind of project. So you have to start thinking in terms of what your question is, and then approach it in a way that you think this makes sense in order to get the answer to that question. The other project that I did before this one is on mining and poverty reduction in Latin America and Africa. So this was the project on Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. What I did there is I wanted to know how countries use their mining rents for development. Do they actually have a, do they finance social policy through mining? And so what I did is I picked 2 countries in Latin America and 2 countries in Africa, and then looked at the political economy dynamics between, so then you have 4 models instead of 2. Of course, this is a little bit more, probably more for like a grant level application. But at the PhD level, I think you could think about sort of the different elements that are important in your project. So if it's about, if it's a question of how do we deal with, political economy of development banks or finance, then you have to start thinking, what do you want to get out of it? I want to see different models of how you finance development. Then you pick 2 cases where it shows different models. And then I think from that point, you can start to construct the research design based on what you proposed would be the potential answers. So I think if you're at a stage where you're trying to figure out a question, or you're trying to figure out an argument that you want to build, I think this is the moment where you could take a little bit of a risk. It might work, it might not work, but you could change the case if it really doesn't work. But otherwise, I think generally, if you know the literature, you kind of have a sense of the comparable cases, you have a sense of what you might get out of it, and then and then I think you formulate the research design around it. Is that
I think
useful?
I think it was useful. Tomorrow there'll be more on case studies and case selection and methodology.